Now in Photoshop, I already have that opened here, 2-point perspective traced. Right, and you'll see the same layers that I had inside my original Illustrator document are now inside Photoshop. But you'll see how kind of nasty they become, right? I'm going to drag out my layer stack here so it's really big on the screen. Right, so you'll see how even though this is my base structure, my base containers of data, within that there's a lot of jumbled mess within it. So it's you got to start beginning to organize a little bit. So there's a little bit of organization within it. How I manage making sure that I don't get lost when I'm clicking down in stacks and everything, because it can get confusing, even I get confused, is on the eyeball, right? If I right click on this layer where the eyeball is, but not on the eyeball, I can tell it that I want this to indicate as red, this to indicate as green, this to indicate as blue. Right, and what that does is then it means that I'm working now in my forward element, so it'll change all the other layers underneath their designation as blue. It doesn't mean they're changing the color, it's just categorization, so visually my eye can navigate this plethora of layers that you're going to end up having. Right, obviously my color fill is in the back. This live paint, right, every time you do a live paint option, it's just going to come up as live paint in the stack. So if you name this correctly in Photoshop or Illustrator prior to the export, it's less to do in Photoshop. So under the live paint, right, I need to actually select those and figure out what the heck they are first. And then under that, it is actually auto select is on or off, but make sure show transfer controls is checked on your direct selection. So I know that that is, if I hide that part, right, it looks like that is my window trim. So if I zoom in on that area, that is my window trim, right? So then what I'll do is I'll call this window trim then, so I can start cleaning this up a little bit. And then each thing, remember we have this idea from Illustrator, fills and stroke values, right? So I'm going to get each one of those now as a separate layer underneath the live paint group. So when I select this, and sometimes you need to like kind of click and drag it over. The first one typically in the stack is the outline. I'm just going to Control Z, so I'll call that outline. And then the next one underneath that would be then the fill. So then each one of these live paints ends up with a fill and an outline. Okay. So then the next one up in the stack I know is going to be the window. And I can kind of fly through this because I remember what they are. We got outline, outline, fill. And then the next one up I gotta, so you'll see then I have a layer inside a layer inside of a layer. So there's a grouping and a grouping and a grouping. So it gets to be a little chaotic at times. So I select that one, and I believe that's going to be my image and then my carpet. So, yeah. So those are all of my foreground elements, right, with my walls and carpet. I'm just going to call it walls for now. It's going to be outline. I wish they'd turn that down a little bit. And then fill. Okay. So then it's so far, if you notice, I have a grouping and it only has walls in it, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag that out of its stack, and it's just going to be underneath that container. Same container, but I'm dragging it out of that grouping, right? And then if there's nothing inside a group, I have a group and a group that have both nothing in them now, which means I can basically delete that off, and then it cleans that up a little bit better. Okay, so it begins to come into, and again, if you're more diligent in Illustrator than I was when I was cranking this out, you would obviously have a little better time with playing with this. So in this case, right, I have nothing on that one either, so I can delete that group off. And then that covers all my forward elements. Now I'm going to drag that completely out of the stack. So that's going to be an entirely new grouping altogether. And in some cases, since I'm starting to build out this rendering, so I'm going to have control over the window color, I'm going to have control over the baseboard colors and everything else, is I start to then just drag my windows out of there as well. So I'm looking in a stack that has all, I can look definitively. Here's my carpet grouping, here's my window trim grouping, here's my here's my ceiling grouping, and everything else, and then walls as well. Gets dragged out. And then that forward element, since there's nothing in it, well, white's in there. So that's my background color. Since there's nothing, there should be nothing then left in that layer, I can then delete that out. So from there, I've now pieced out, I have my background, my walls, my window trim, my window, and now I have my carpet. And then carpet, I know it's going to have some operative elements in it, so I'll go ahead and, oops, maximize this guy. You can see it inside my layer stack here. Redock that. Alright, so I go ahead and I'm going to group that. Remember, grouping is taking that down to the folder, and then I'm going to call that group carpet as well. And then I'm going to do some things later on with that. And then the next thing is just to go through and check all the other pieces, right? So I have beams, and under beams I have another live paint group, right? And then, so the layers don't necessarily always match up correctly. I'm just going to call this beams. And then call this one outline. Remember, outline and then fill for each one of these live paint groups. Bless you, by the way. Welcome. And then some beams. We're going to drag that out. Oops. And then I can delete that original container too. And then my layer 1, I want to see what's on layer 1. Layer 1 was my base image. Well, obviously, right, that should be at the bottom now, because now we're worrying about coloring. Right? So my base image comes with it. Right? So now if I have, right, some of you may go ahead and go, oops, I made my window underneath my window trim. You'll see that the way I originally drew this was not a definitive way. I just put a block of color on top of a block of color and called it a day, right? So be aware that layer stacking and things like that come into play.